And this would be the equivalent of Manifest Destiny Part 1. So it defines Manifest Destiny, it talks about Texas, the Mexican War, Oregon, and gets us up to the Compromise of 1850. It is necessary for you to know who coined the term Manifest Destiny, and that would be John L. O'Sullivan in 1841. He was a newspaper man talking about Western expansion. And he says, "We are the nation of human progress. Providence is with us. No earthly power can stop us." I mean, that's a pretty bold statement. You just got to find room, guys. But this idea that God somehow smiled on the American experiment, the American people, and allowed them the opportunity to travel west, and that the North American continent was America's. Not the Spanish, not the English, not the Russians, not the French, not the Native Americans by any stretch. Those people were all to be removed if they were not going to live under the American system. And the belief was of a lot of these people who bought into the Manifest Destiny ideology that America's ideas of liberty and freedom were superior, and that those superior ideals of freedom and liberty would spread progress to an otherwise backward people, whether that was the Native Americans or any of the other powers that had influence on the North American continent. So knowing what Manifest Destiny is and who coined the term is important. I'm going to skip Turner. Now, people had been traveling west. Well, I mean, for God's sakes, people had been traveling west, going all the way back to the folks in Jamestown and in Plymouth and in Massachusetts Bay. They looked at the tree line just beyond the shore and said, "That's ours." So that concept of Manifest Destiny and spread it. You're going to have to find space on the floor or something, guys. Don't just stand there. You're going to... guys, come on. Get here on time. Find a spot. So people have been traveling west. When I think of Manifest Destiny prior to this period, I always think of the Scots-Irish settlers, going into the frontier, going into the unknown of the mountains along the East Coast. They were practicing Manifest Destiny. They were going into land that they believed was theirs by destiny. So people traveling west, especially after the purchase of Louisiana, along the Oregon Trail, along the Santa Fe Trail, along the Mormon Trail, along the California Trail, you had people traveling out west with this notion in their minds that the land out west was America's. We've talked about Oregon before. America had agreed in the Treaty of 1818 that they would jointly occupy Oregon with Great Britain for a span of 10 years. Well, 10 years became 20 years, and 20 years became 30 years, and America and Britain kept kicking that can down the road until by the 1840s, the United States is going to declare that they've got the stronger hold on Oregon, and so therefore they are going to claim Oregon. The question is, where exactly is America claiming? This was America's claim, not just here, here's Oregon, here's Washington State, but all the way up here to the 5440 line. Okay? What today is the southern boundary of Alaska. It's in the middle of British Columbia. So the United States is making an extreme claim here in Oregon. Now, of course, likewise, the British are also making an extreme claim all the way down to what would be the border of Northern California. So so the American slogan becomes 5440 or fight. Whenever you hear 5440 or fight, they're referring to the northernmost extreme line here, the Oregon Territory, and the American claim that all this was the United States. Now, the idea of or fight comes from the idea that the Polk administration, who's taking up this issue, is threatening to go to war with Great Britain over this territory. In the same breath, the Polk administration is also threatening to go to war with Mexico over disputed territory in Texas. So you've got a president threatening to go to war on two fronts over territory and expansion. So this is a major deal. Polk is definitely an expansionist president. So how does this get resolved? Well, I mean, you can see right here. Split the difference. Just extend the Treaty of 1818 line all the way out to the Pacific, and for good measure, we'll give Vancouver to the British. And that's how it gets resolved. So war is avoided. America and Great Britain compromise over this, and they split the difference. Now, this idea of compromise and splitting the difference didn't just come out of thin air. It came after about 30 years of America and Britain realizing that they had more in common than they had different, and that it would probably be in the best interest of the United States and Britain to find a way to work together rather than be at each other's throats. And there had been a number of conflicts between the United States and Great Britain. You had the Oregon boundary dispute. You had a couple of incidents along the United States-Canadian border with escaped slaves and armed shipments and things like that. That you'll never need to know this. You had a conflict going on between British settlers and American settlers up here in northern Maine that became known as the Aroostook War, and this was over where exactly the northern boundary of Maine was. The Americans claim there. The British claim it's down here. And the Aroostook War and the Maine boundary issue was over logging rights, lumber. In the 1840s, ships of the line are still made of wood. The British Navy, largest navy in the world, needs wood. The American Navy needs wood. So this lumber in Maine is really important. And rather than go to a full-fledged war, and instead you just have these battling lumberjacks hacking at each other, rather than go into a full-fledged war over this, the Secretary of State under John Tyler in 1842 enters into negotiations with the British, and that was Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster was the Secretary of State. And they come to an agreement to split the difference at the Aroostook River, which today is the northern boundary of Maine. So by signing the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which is probably about the only thing that gets done during the Tyler administration, by the way, nothing else gets done. But by doing this, it establishes a precedent between the United States and Great Britain to find a way to work together to compromise on their differences of opinion. So from the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842, you get the resolution of the Oregon boundary dispute in 1846 along the same lines. Which brings us to James K. Polk. And who in the world was James K. Polk, and why do we need to know it? James K. Polk was elected president in 1844. He ran against the venerable Henry Clay, who was going up for president for a third time. And boy, that's the closest Henry Clay came. I mean, look, it's pretty evenly divided here in terms of popular vote. The only thing that throws the election to Polk is this 2% of the popular vote from the Liberty Party, and they secured about 50,000 votes up here in the burned-over district of upstate New York, and it was just enough votes to sway an otherwise Whig-leaning New York to go the Democrats' way, and Polk wins New York, Polk wins the election, and the interesting thing about James K. Polk was that he was an unknown. Nobody knew who this guy was. As a matter of fact, the Whig slogan in the 1844 campaign was, "Who is James K. Polk?" That's a question everybody wanted to know. Polk was what is considered a dark horse candidate, or a compromise candidate. You had maybe 2 or 3 more prominent names vying for the Democratic nomination, but none of those guys could get a majority of the vote. And so rather than duke it out over these guys, the convention looks for somebody who doesn't offend anyone. So James K. Polk isn't necessarily the best candidate. He's the candidate who offends the least. That's what a dark horse is. And when you start to have political conventions after the anti-Masonic Party in 1832 held the first political convention, but after the Whigs and the Democrats and the Republicans and the Democrats start to hold political conventions to choose their nominees, you're going to wind up not necessarily having the best candidate. You're going to wind up having the candidate who offends the least. And a number of these guys up here get the nomination of their party not because they're the most intelligent or the most prominent person, but because they're the guy who didn't anger anybody. Polk was a dark horse. Pierce was a dark horse. Lincoln, for God's sakes, was a dark horse. There were 3 other guys trying to get the nomination who were better known than Abraham Lincoln. So you've got a number of dark horse candidates throughout American history. Polk is really the first one. And Polk is an interesting guy. He did not want to be president. He said, guys, I was Speaker of the House of Representatives. I own a plantation in Tennessee. I'm good friends with Andrew Jackson. I don't really need or want to be president. So if you guys want to elect me president, that's great. I'm only serving 1 term. I'm going to serve 1 term. I've got 4 things I want to do. I want to lower the tariff. I want to stabilize the banking system after the divorce bill and the Depression and all that stuff. I want to annex Texas and Oregon to America's favor, and I want to acquire California. This guy comes in March 4th, 1845. By March 4th, 1849, all of this had been essentially done. He is the most effective 1-term president you've never heard of. These are the 4 things I want to do. He did those 4 things. He left office. It don't get any better than that. Of course, he died like 6 months after he left office. But so anyway, let me hold on a second. Let me go back here. Nope, not going to allow me to go back. All right. So he lowers the tariff. Great. Because he believes that lowering the tariff will benefit the average Joe. You lower tariffs, prices go down, there's more competition, better for the average man. Democratic Party. Stabilize banking. Yes, he does. He makes sure that the divorce bill and the independent treasury are stabilized, and that private banking is private banking, and that the two are permanently separated for the time being. Annexing Oregon, he's going to get Oregon. Now, granted, he's the one that's claiming 54-40 or fight, but he's also the one who's willing to compromise. So he compromises at the 49th parallel, which gets us to Texas and gets us to California. Texas, of course, had been an issue going on even before the 1820s. If you remember, America had laid claims to Texas during the Louisiana Purchase era and the Lewis and Clark expedition. Another guy named Zebulon Pike had taken a southerly route and laid American claims into Texas. Those claims were given back to Spain in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. But by 1822, 21, 22, 23, most of the Latin American countries that had been under Spanish rule were now independent, including Mexico. And Mexico, as a newly independent country, in need of some stability, in need of cash, is going to invite Americans, wealthy Americans in particular, to move to Texas in the 1820s. And it solves two problems for the brand new Mexican government. One, it solves the Native American issue that they've got going on. There aren't enough Mexicans living in Texas. There's too many Native Americans living there. So by bringing in these people from the United States, the Mexican government believed that their Native American issue could be solved. And the second thing that bringing in these guys does is it brings in their big, fat wallets and infuses the Mexican government with some stable currency and cash. So people like Stephen Austin, people like Sam Houston, people like Davy Crockett, William Travis, Jim Bowie, they're going to move to Texas with the promise of new land, promise of opportunity, to be able to do what it is that they do. And what was it that these guys did? They were planter elites. They were guys that were looking to get rich off of cotton in East Texas. So they not only brought their wealth with them, they brought their slaves with them as well. And they start to populate the northern Mexican state of Texas. But there's a problem. Too many Americans are crossing the border. There are too many Americans moving into Texas. Mexico has got an illegal immigration problem. Too many Americans crossing the border. So Mexico decides we've got to put a stop to this. There are too many American immigrants coming to Mexico. I know, up is down, night is day, black is white, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. So what do? What does the Mexican government do? The Mexican government makes living in Texas intolerable for Americans. One, the Mexican government declares that every Mexican citizen must convert to Catholicism. And two, the Mexican government abolishes slavery. And so, believing that that would drive the Americans out, Mexico passes those laws. Mexico doesn't know America very well. Americans don't like to be told what religion to practice, and they certainly don't want to be told that their slaves are being taken away. And so the Americans living in Texas, the Texicans, if you will, are going to revolt against the Mexican government over the issue of slavery. They want to be able to keep their slaves. They feel that the Mexican government is oppressing them. And you wind up with the Texas Revolution, led by such luminaries as Sam Houston, who had been an assistant to Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812, and other people. And you wind up with a number of battles in here, and the Texas Revolution really only takes about a year. And the Americans living in Texas, the Texicans, if I could just call them Texicans, it would make my life easier. The Texicans ultimately win. But we're always told to remember something. What are we supposed to remember? The Alamo. But why? Why am I supposed to remember? I'm told remember the Alamo, but why am I supposed to remember the Alamo? Anybody ever hear the story of the Alamo? Davy Crockett? Yeah, pretty much everybody died. There were about 400, and it wasn't just Americans, and that's really the thing that everybody loses track of. Everybody thinks that it was like 400 Americans inside this mission at the mercy of 1,000 Mexican troops. It was a hodgepodge of people in there. I mean, you had Americans, yes, but you also had women. Had their wives. Some Native Americans. You had some blacks in there. You had some Mexicans who weren't too satisfied with the Mexican government. So you had a real variety of people in the Alamo who were holed up against Santa Anna and his forces. And yes, Santa Anna's superior forces were able to overtake the Alamo in the Battle of San Antonio, and the people by and large within the Alamo were massacred. And of course, there's this whole debate over where exactly they were massacred. Of course, if they're massacred inside the Alamo, then they died defending the place. If they were massacred outside the Alamo, then obviously they surrendered. And for Texans, it's very important that they died within the walls of the Alamo, defending the Alamo from the oppressive Mexicans. We can't have Davy Crockett surrendering to the Mexicans. He had to die, with his boots on. So Texas is independent, and immediately they apply for annexation to the United States, but they don't get annexed, which is unusual. It's curious. Why wouldn't the United States annex this new territory to the rest of the United States? In 1836, that's when the application for statehood was proffered, and it was rejected by the Jackson administration. And the reason why is Jackson feared reopening the slave debate. If Texas were to come into the Union, there would be this whole brouhaha over the imbalance of free and slave states. How many slave states are we going to be able to carve out of Texas and whatnot? And quite frankly, let's be honest, in 1836, Andrew Jackson just wants to leave office and retire. He's at the end of his second term. He's in his last year. He doesn't need the Texas headache. And so he kicks the can down the road and he says, let my successor take care of it. Oh yeah, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren's going to handle this, right? Martin Van Buren's got a depression for all 4 years of his presidency. He's got economic troubles. He doesn't want to open up a sectional debate over slavery in the middle of a depression. So Van Buren kicks that can down the road to his successor, William Henry Harrison. Hey, Harrison, what do you want to? What do you? I think he's dead. So he's not even around long enough to do anything about it. And so it gets kicked to John Tyler. And John Tyler's presidency is a disaster because John Tyler, being a Whig in name only, just because he didn't like Andrew Jackson, Tyler and Henry Clay are getting into it because Tyler keeps vetoing Whig legislation, and eventually in 1842, John Tyler was booted out of the Whig Party. So he was a man without a party, and nothing was happening during his presidency. So it gets left for the election of 1844, and James K. Polk says, look, man, if I get elected president, I'm going to annex Texas because Britain is trying to do an end run around the United States and get their cotton from Texas and not the American South, and I'm not allowing that to happen. So in the 9 years that Texas is independent, they have their own president, they have their own Congress, They have their own Supreme Court. They've got their own Constitution, and it looks miraculously a lot like our Constitution, except it says, no one shall mess with slavery. It's in there, black and white, in the Texas Constitution. No one will mess with, well, I mean, it doesn't say no one will mess with slavery, but that's what's in there. So, I mean, guys, remember in the Alamo? Great. Texas independence? Great. The Lone Star State? Terrific. Sam Houston, Stephen Austin, all those guys? Terrific. American heroes are all household names. And they were all fighting to promote slavery. Just so you know. So, once Polk comes into office, Texas is now a state in 1845, okay? But what exactly is Texas? The Mexicans claim that this is Texas. Americans say, no, this is Texas. So there's a difference of opinion between what the Mexicans recognize as Texas and what the Americans recognize as Texas. And so the Polk administration is going to send a diplomat to Mexico City to negotiate over the Texas boundary issue, John Slidell. John Slidell is sent to Mexico City with two purposes. One, settle this dispute and establish the American boundary of Texas at the Rio Grande, and two, offer to buy California. I think we offered somewhere in the ballpark of 15 mil. I don't know. I can't remember the exact number, but it was something like that. So Slidell is sent there to take care of these two things, Texas and California. Polk sends him there knowing that the negotiations were going to go nowhere, knowing that Slidell's offer was going to be rejected. When Mexico City rejects Slidell's offer, Polk says, I'm shocked. Shocked, I tells you, that the Mexicans rejected this offer. And so Polk is going to order troops into this disputed area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River in order to secure America's claim to this border region. Now, mind you, there are Mexican troops also in this border region. And when you get American troops and guns and Mexican troops and guns occupying the same space, things happen. Shots were fired. Who fired them? Who knows? Who cares? Shots were fired. Polk says, aha! The Mexicans have spilled American blood on American soil. Congress, I ask you for a declaration of war to defend America's honor in this matter. And Congress says, yes, sir, yes, sir. 2 bags full. And we go to war with Mexico because they killed American troops on American soil. And you wind up with the Mexican War. Now, the only thing you need to know about the Mexican War itself is we won. If you take a look here, the blue represents American victories. There aren't too many Mexican victories, like a Battle of San Pascual outside of San Diego, and that's about it. For the most part, this is the kind of war that Americans love. It's quick. We get a lot of stuff. There's lots of victories. We love those kind of wars. And so, and a lot of heroes come out of the war. Oh yeah, a whole new generation of heroes. Zachary Taylor, who had been victorious here at the beginning of the war. Winfield Scott, who had led the invasion into Mexico City and ultimately conquers Mexico. You had over here Stephen Carney and John C. Fremont. They are the guys who convinced the Mexicans living in California to revolt against the Mexican government and establish an independent bear flag republic in California. And so for about 9 months, California technically is its own country. With this hodgepodge of Carney, Fremont, and the Californios, the rancheros who lived out in California, the Mexicans who lived there, trying to run the show. So in the end, you've got a victory here for the Americans. Zachary Taylor emerges early on as a hero, and you know what Americans love to do with their war heroes. They love to make them president. And James K. Polk catches wind that Zachary Taylor may just be a Whig. And so Polk, looking at how successful Zachary Taylor is and how efficient and good a general Zachary Taylor is, what does Polk do? Fires him. Because he's too good. He's too efficient. He's a potential Whig nominee in 1848, and as a Democrat, Polk can't have that. So they get rid of old Rough and Ready, and they hire old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott, who weighed about 300 pounds, and it took a couple of guys to hoist him up on his horse. Glandular problem? I don't know. Maybe. Winfield Scott, less ambitious, as you can tell. And we win! USA! USA! Johnny, tell them what they've won! You've won the Mexican Cession. That's right. You get all the territory from West Texas and New Mexico all the way to the Pacific Ocean. James K. Polk is the man primarily responsible for making the United States a continental power. That is a lot of new land from Oregon all the way down to Baja California, from Texas all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. Wow! Can I take my slaves there? Huh? What? Huh? Can I take the slaves there? What a good question. Can I take my slaves there? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gives us all this land. Heck, we even gave Mexico some money for California just for the problem. But this issue of whether this territory was open for slavery is going to be there for a while. There had been people who had been opposed to the war. Henry David Thoreau's civil disobedience, we talked about that. But here's a noteworthy guy. Congressman Abraham Lincoln, in his 2-year term in Congress, happened to be there during the Mexican War, 1847 to 49, and he debates James K. Polk's honesty. He says, I think James K. Polk lied us into a war, telling us that there were weapons of mass telling us that American blood had been spilled on American soil. I demand to know the exact spot where American blood was shed. I want to see the exact spot where the Mexicans fired the first shot, because quite frankly, President Polk, I don't believe you. You remember when the Federalists came out against the War of 1812 after we had won the war, and that had been really tone deaf and led to the death of the Federalist Party? Yeah. Congressman Abraham Lincoln is told by his constituents, don't bother running for re-election in 1848, you will never win. He had become so unpopular for his anti-war opposition that he was told, don't bother running for re-election. He was known as Spotty Lincoln, or the miserable man of spots, this spot resolutions followed him around for a long time. And of course, he goes into political obscurity, never to be heard from again. But the real issue over slavery in the territory is raised by a backbench Democrat from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot. And it occurs at the beginning of the war. Wilmot makes the proposal that any territory we acquire from Mexico should be off limits to slavery. And this is raised and voted on in Congress. It passes the House, but it is rejected in the Senate. So it does not become a law. You do not have exclusion to slavery in the Western Territory, but it doesn't matter. The issue has been raised. And the South goes berserk over the Wilmot Proviso. If I could make a guarantee of something you will see on the exam regarding this time period, the Wilmot Proviso is it. Because it is this proposal that opens the door to the slavery debate in the West. As a matter of fact, an entire third political party is formed around the idea of the Wilmot Proviso. It's called the Free Soil Party, and they run a candidate in the 1848 election. Now, lest you think that they're abolitionists, they're generally not. They believe that the West should be open for whites only. But they want the West available for white free labor to compete for wages. These people said white labor cannot compete with slave labor. We want the West available for free white labor. And they run a candidate in the 1848 election, former President Martin Van Buren, trying to get back in the game. No. So, in the 1848 election, the Whigs go ahead and nominate Zachary Taylor. The Democrats nominate somebody named Lewis Cass from Michigan. The Free Soil Party nominates Van Buren, and Zachary Taylor wins a pretty convincing victory in the Electoral College. But here's the issue. Nobody knows where Taylor stands on slavery in the territories or anything like that until the issue of the California gold rush and the need to create California as a state to provide law and order there. Taylor comes out and says, I want California to be entered as a free state, and the South says, over our dead body. And that's why you have the need for the Compromise of 1850. All right.